Welcome back to our study in the book of Acts. Today we're going to talk about 5 chapters. I know it sounds like a lot, but actually we've already looked at the material in 2 of these chapters. Chapter 22 and chapter 26 is Paul's rendition of his own conversion account, which we've obviously already read Luke's rendition in chapter 9. So we're not going to spend a great deal of time there. The other chapters are all Paul's defense, his apologia, to use the Greek word, before various Roman entities. Chapter 23 is the Jewish Sanhedrin. Now, I know that's not technically a Roman entity, but they were under Roman control. Chapter 24, then, Paul moves from the Jews to a trial before Felix. Now, Felix was in the same political position as Pontius Pilate, only he did a way worse job. Chapter 25, Felix is moved out, his replacement Festus is moved in, and Paul gives his defense again to Festus. It is there that he will make his appeal to Caesar. And chapter 26, because Festus had nothing really to write to Caesar, he brings in his friend Herod Agrippa II, and Paul gets to give his defense before him. So basically what we're looking at is a series of trial narratives. Uninteresting on the surface, perhaps. However, what we discover in Paul's strategy is how he leveraged the resources at his fingertips to get through these trials, through the imprisonment, and on to Rome. So what I want to do today is such an important lesson, is to look at Paul's example of how to leverage what you have. The banner under which we will do this lesson, the pillar upon which the church is built, is called resourcefulness. How do you take the tools that God has given you and use them in the midst of the rough and tumble of real world politics in order to make Jesus famous? And we're going to identify 6 specific tools that Paul used to leverage his opportunity to proclaim Christ. Tool number 1 is the tool of his own citizenship. And in chapter 2, we find that after Paul has given his defense address on the stair step, and he gets to the word Gentile, and his fellow Jews just go crazy. Listen to what they say in verse 22. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live." As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. The commander whisks him away from the very volatile and dangerous situation on the stair steps of the fortress of Antonius, just on the northwest side of the Temple Mount. He takes Paul into a private room and he says, interrogate him. Now, what that means in their day was kind of like Guantanamo. You're going to tie someone up and you're going to torture them to try to get the truth out of them. That may sound cruel to you, but in the ancient days, it was assumed that people are more likely to tell the truth when they're tortured than when they're not. So there Paul is, tied up. Sneak down into verse 25. As they stretched Paul out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" Well, the answer is no. The law Lex Portia forbade you to bind a Roman citizen who hadn't been convicted. And Lex Valeria forbade the beating of a Roman citizen who hadn't been convicted. So the centurion standing there who's just tied Paul up is going to be under the same condemnation as he put Paul. In other words, if you bind a Roman citizen, you get bound up. If you beat a Roman citizen, you get beat. He is now really nervous because Paul has him under a barrel. He cuts Paul down and then he runs into the commander and says, "Commander, you're about to beat a Roman citizen. Do you really want me to do that?" And he said, "I didn't know he's a Roman citizen." So the commander pulls Paul out and says, I'm a Roman citizen too, and I spent a lot of money to get my Roman citizenship. What's he asking? He's asking Paul, how valuable is your Roman citizen? Like are you a born citizen, or did you buy it? Because they were stratified in the amount of honor they had. And Paul puffs out his Jewish chest and says, I was actually born a Roman citizen. Hint, hint, you're in some deep trouble, buddy. So he lets him go, and now he's got no choice. So what does he do? Chapter 22 gives way to chapter 23. The only way to find out what the charges are against Paul, because he still doesn't know. They were beating Paul on the stair steps. He rescues Paul. Now he's going to bind him and beat him to find out what he did, but he can't because he's a Roman citizen. What do you do next? Answer, you let the Jewish Supreme Council have a kind of court of meeting to find out what the real hullabaloo was all about. So chapter 23, Paul is taken over to the Sanhedrin. The commander convenes the Sanhedrin, and they're delighted. I mean, he probably legally couldn't force them to do it, but the Sanhedrin is delighted because now they get another crack at this criminal called Paul. Now, watch what it says in verse 1. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, my brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. That actually is the second tool that Paul leveraged. It was his religious leadership as a Pharisee. Now we're going to see it unpack in a little bit, but the word I've lived, where Paul says I've fulfilled my duty to God, the word is actually politeuomai. Do you see in that word any English word? Well, sure, politics. And you might be thinking, how can Paul say, I've lived with all good conscience to this day, when he was really conscience riddled because of killing Christians? The answer is in the word. Paul is not claiming that his conscience was clear, but that his public political activity was clear. Every time he beat a Christian, every time he imprisoned a Christian, he thought he was doing the right thing. In that sense, no one could convict Paul of not trying to follow and obey God. Does that mean he'd never sinned? No. Obviously, there were sins of the heart and sins of the mind. But in terms of convicting Paul of a crime, no one could do that. Now, when Paul made that claim, it infuriated the high priest, who ordered Paul to be slapped. It's not legal, but it's a way of saying, how dare you contradict? The high priest says you're a criminal, so you are a criminal. And Paul looks at the high priest and says, how dare you strike me, you whitewashed wall? Which in those days, that was a real kind of an insult. They would whitewash these walls to cover over imperfections and cracks. And he said, you're a crackpot. What are you doing? And then the high priest, or someone slaps him and says, this is the way you speak to the high priest? Paul says, oh, I didn't know he was the high priest. Now, we're not quite sure how sincere Paul is. Some people have tried to defend Paul and say, surely he didn't know he's the high priest. I don't know. Paul has kind of a temper. And probably what he's saying is not, I'm so sorry, I didn't know you're a high priest, but yeah, you're really acting like a high priest. So sorry. That's my guess. I could be wrong. But the response of the crowd makes it clear in an instant that Paul is not going to get a fair trial. So he uses his Pharisaic background in order to really shrewdly leverage the situation. Watch what it says down in verse 6. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I'm a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope in the resurrection of the dead. Paul knew that half the Sanhedrin were Sadducees and half were Pharisees. And the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, whereas the Pharisees do. And Paul just kind of lobs a theological grenade in the middle of them, and they start fighting with each other over the reality of the resurrection. It was a diversion tactic for Paul. But listen, That's still the core of Paul's preaching. And we're going to see this come up 3 or 4 more times in this section of Scripture where he's really on trial, not for disturbing the peace, but for preaching the truth of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Watch how this plays out then down in verse 12. They play tug of war with Paul, literally, like someone's yanking on one arm and the Pharisees are yanking on the other arm. And Claudius has to come in again and rescue Paul's life from these very angry Pharisees and Sadducees. But he's kind of a rag doll being torn back and forth. There was a boarding of justice in the Sanhedrin. So Claudius still doesn't know what the issue is. But there was also then a plot that developed. Verse 12. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. This plot that included more than 40 individuals, well, that's part of the problem. They had too many guys that were ready to kill Paul. But what their strategy was, is that they're going to get 40 guys lining a single street between where the Sanhedrin meets and where Paul is kept prisoner. And in the narrow streets of Jerusalem, you could have people on the second story windows and then on the doorways, and with the Roman soldiers march Paul through under protective custody. Some people will jump out the windows, some people will jump out the doors, and they will assassinate Paul. They themselves will be assassinated. But that's how badly they wanted Paul dead. Now, Paul learns about this plot through a nephew. It actually says down in verse 16, it was the son of Paul's sister. Now, why he was visiting Paul in prison, we don't know. But he comes and really reveals the plot. How did he learn about it? Probably in his living room. In the shame-honor culture of the Middle East, if part of your family member becomes a heretic, it is your obligation to kill them to retain or salvage the honor of the family. And I don't know why this young guy is on Paul's side. Maybe because he converted to Christianity. Maybe because his mother loved her brother. But for whatever reason, he sneaks into the prison like cloak and dagger stuff. And he says, Paul, this is what's going to happen. Now, notice that Paul, this is the third thing Paul leverages, his family influence. Now, some of you have some family influence that you could leverage also for the gospel. Maybe it's through an inheritance. Maybe it's through a business. Maybe it's through a good reputation in town. But that's one of the things that we can leverage is our heritage in our family for the gospel. Paul is very, very shrewd. He says to the boy, go talk only to the commander. And the centurion escorts him to the commander, but the centurion never hears what the boy has to say. The commander then, shrewdly, takes the boy off to the side, listens to the plot, and now the commander has a choice. And this is a real risk for Paul, because the commander could say, okay, I'll let him go, because I'm gonna let the Jews jump on him and kill him. I'm going to kill the Jews. I become a hero for putting down a rebellion, and I get rid of Paul, who's a problem person. I actually commend Claudius Lysias for not taking the easy route out. And it was a risk of Paul, but he knew that justice was a high priority for the Romans, and he was banking on that. This is kind of a political stratagem. It says, the commander dismissed the young man with this warning, don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me. In other words, the commander now has the private information for Paul and could do something about it. Chapter 23 then moves into this interesting narrative of how the commander called these troops together and sent them off in the middle of the night to whisk Paul away to a higher official. Because of this assassination plot, it is now above his pay grade to deal with. But you should know, to help you read this with more insight, the commander has about 1,000 Roman troops at his disposal. How many of them would he be willing to give over to an escort for Paul? Watch. Verse 23. Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. In other words, he chooses a time when it's already dark, people in their houses. You know that it's going to be safe to start moving some troops around. And the people who are seeing the troops move, because it goes right by their door, they're not going to communicate to one another late at night. In other words, he's buying the maximum amount of time to get Paul out of town. But did you count the number of troops? 470. That's nearly half of his troops to escort Paul to safety. Is that realistic? Isn't that overkill? Actually, no. When Pontius Pilate sent an envoy to arrest Jesus, it says in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 3, that there was a company of soldiers. That is 600 men. Similarly, as Pilate gave just over half of his forces to arrest Jesus, so Claudius gives just under half his soldiers to whisk Paul out of town. Both of them ring true to historical detail. Now, fast forward to chapter 24. We're now up in Caesarea, and several days go by, almost a week, for the high priest to get a lawyer on retainer named Tertullus. Tertullus, his name is Latin, so we assume that he's a Latin speaker. He might be a Jew that grew up in Rome speaking Latin, probably a high-class, well-educated lawyer. My guess is Jewish background, but Roman culture. And he is going to take it upon himself to convict and condemn Paul. So it takes a few days to get all the information together, get his case together, and then they show up in Caesarea. Now you can find this on the map. Jerusalem was the capital for the Jews. Caesarea on the coast was the capital of the Romans, built by Herod the Great. But it had always, in that period of time, been the capital where the Roman governors lived, including Pontius Pilate. He didn't live in Jerusalem. He lived in Caesarea. And if you've ever been to Caesarea, you'll know why. Beautiful coastal city. But they convene this court, and Tertullus begins with what's called a captatio benevolentiae. It's a Latin term that basically means sucking up. You begin your trial, but whether you're defense or the prosecutor, with some compliments to the judge. Oh, you're such a great judge, and oh, you're so wonderful. If you read what he said, you would say, liar, liar, pants on fire. This is pure sucking up. This is disingenuous favor he's trying to court from Felix. Paul, in contrast, also gives a captatio benevolentiae, but his is much more honest. Listen to verse 10. I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. Paul's captatio benevolentiae was quite different than Felix's. Rather than this flowery rhetoric, this really disingenuous sucking up, Paul just states the fact. Look, you've been here a while, you should know the facts, I'm going to proceed. And he does. And the way Paul proceeds is actually very sophisticated. And you might not pick it up just reading the English, but like in English, the Greeks had very specific ways that they would speak on different occasions. If you were giving a testimony, or if you're in a court of law, or if you were preaching a sermon, there are certain things that you should cover and certain evidences that would be more compelling. And this was all written in these rhetorical books that the Greeks had studied. And if you're going to be an orator, you should have studied those books to know what is appropriate on different situations and occasions. And Paul apparently did. If you look at each of his speeches in chapter 22 through 26, and there's a speech in every one of them, you will notice that Paul's sermons and speeches fit hand in glove with what the rhetorical teacher said would be appropriate and compelling. So the fourth thing that Paul leverages is the cultural ways of communication. And if we're going to be effective as church planners, we need to keep up not only with like sermon notes and how to present a sermon in a compelling way, and that does change over time, but also with PR and social media and how to connect with communities in ways that are convincing and compelling. The fifth thing that Paul leverages is down in verse 15. It says, I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. And what Paul is leveraging is evangelism. He never backs off of his core message of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, even though it would be convenient to do so. And we're going to see every single chapter, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, all of them mention the resurrection. Even though he was on trial for this disturbing the peace, he uses his trials as a platform for preaching the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which should be a lesson to us. If we're going to be an effective church, we have to leverage our core message. And one of the most frightening things that's happened in theology over the last 25 years is that theology has been replaced by psychology. The holiness of God has been replaced with human happiness. And you can look through people's sermons and you'll find that they've gone much more topical than textual, and they've gone much more to psychology and human happiness than God and our obligation for holiness. Just saying. The sixth thing that Paul leverages is the law. Down here in verse 19, it says, but there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. What Paul is pointing out to Felix is you really don't have a case here. If I'm on trial for disturbing the peace, then where are the eyewitnesses that saw me in that action? They're back home in Asia. Therefore, this case should have been thrown out. Now, it wasn't, because Felix was, frankly, a terrible governor. In fact, the Roman historian Tacitus says that he was a master of cruelty and lust, who ruled with the power of a king, but the mind of a slave. And he was actually raised as a slave in Rome. But when he was released, he was given by Caesar's household the power of this governorship, and he was just terrible at it. In fact, in a couple of years, he's going to be taken out of office and replaced with Festus. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I want you to see how slavish was his mind and how bold was Paul's preaching. Again, we notice in verse 21, Paul says, it is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you this day. Move down to verse 25, because Paul has a captivating personality. And Felix was actually pretty interested in Paul, as was his wife Drusilla, who had been raised in the Herodian household. So she heard rumors from her grandfather about this baby Jesus he tried to kill, and her uncle Herod, that actually did kill Jesus with Pontius Pilate, and another uncle who died in chapter 12 being eaten by worms because he had tried to kill Peter and did kill the apostle James. So it ran in the family. She's got some interest in this whole Christian setting. So Drusilla and Felix frequented Paul. And listen to the boldness of Paul. He doesn't back off of the message. Verse 25. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you." At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. And then when 2 years passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. We'll pause there. I find it fascinating that Felix, who has such an interest in Paul personally, and his wife is interested in him professionally, he hears about the gospel message of Jesus Christ, and yet is trying to get a bribe out of the guy that he considers a godly man. It's completely messed up. So rightly, he's taken out of office, and Festus replaces him. And that takes us into chapter 25. It opens by saying 3 days after Festus was in office, he went from Caesarea to Jerusalem. You might want to look at it on a map and see kind of the route they took and the distance it was. But he wasted no time getting down to the central business of this problem called Paul. And when he gets to Jerusalem, after 2 years of imprisonment, they're still fuming, wanting Paul's head on a platter. And Festus, to his credit, says, no, I'm not going to give it to you. It wouldn't be fair. You come up to Caesarea, he'll stand trial. The day after he returns to Caesarea, Paul stands trial before him. Again, he's not wasting any time. And Paul, he's in a hard place now. And Festus is too, because Festus realizes at the trial, hey, these Jews aren't going away, and Paul's not going away. What do I do? So he makes an offer in verse 9. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? That would get Paul off of his plate. And he knew that there were going to be some rabble-rousers along the route who would assassinate Paul. In other words, he's thrown under the bus. And Paul's not taking the bait. He says, I'm standing trial where I should be. And if there's anything that they have against me, they can bring it here. But because they're not, and this is the key word, it's a game changer for this whole trial narrative, down in verse 11, I appeal to Caesar. Now, we don't know exactly through the historical details of when someone had the right to do that. But if you're a Roman citizen and had reached a loggerhead at the highest legal statute of your area, you could in fact appeal to Caesar under some circumstances. Paul does. It immediately brings the trial to a halt. But that puts Festus in a terrible position, because in his first week of his new reign as governor, he's sending someone to Caesar that he couldn't take care of himself. It doesn't look good on his resume. Worse than that, he has nothing to write. He's got no reason to send him up there. So fortunately for him, a new friend comes into town, Herod Agrippa II, with his sister and lover, you figure that one out, Bernice. And he says, hey, congratulations, you're the new guy in town, you're the highest Roman official, I'm the highest Jewish official, let's extend hands and be friends. He says, I'll tell you what, I'm really glad you're here because I've got this problem called Paul, and I think you're just the guy to help me craft a letter to the emperor explaining what my problem is. So Herod's delighted, and so is Bernice. They've heard about this Paul, this whole Jesus movement. It runs in the Herod family. And so with all this pomp and circumstances, there's all these important people up in the balcony and Paul in chains. And he preaches the gospel with incredible power and calls Herod Agrippa to account. Again, if you look at the rhetorical sophistication of Paul here, you will be duly impressed. You'll also be impressed down in verse 8. Again, the core is resurrection, resurrection, resurrection. Turn the page into chapter 26. That the Messiah would suffer, and as the first to rise from the dead, would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles. This talk of someone rising from the dead sounded insane to Festus. And he said, Paul, you're out of your mind. And Paul, with a calm gravitas, says, no, I'm not out of my mind. And then he begins to press Agrippa. You know this is true. Look at it down in verse 27. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Then Agrippa said to Paul, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? That's a confusing phrase, even in the Greek. In fact, if you put it up on the screen, you can see it says literally, with little, time, money, persuasion, what? With little, you persuade me to be a Christian. And in a number of instances in the Bible, I think if I could just be there, I would have heard the vocal inflection and it would have been clear. I don't think that's true with this. I think Herod was as confusing in person as he is in English. Why? Because he means to be. Paul is pushing him towards a decision for Jesus Christ, and he's throwing up a smokescreen to keep Paul at bay. A lesson comes out of this for me. Sometimes people come to a point where they're ready to hear Jesus, they're open to the gospel, but they just can't take that final step. That's too bad, because sometimes the Holy Spirit draws a line and says, you know what? You've already heard, that's the last time I will compel you to come to Christ. And without the Holy Spirit drawing us, none of us will come to Christ. The chapter finishes with this simple statement, verse 32. Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." That is false. Though the law said he could have been set free, that was never going to happen in the real life situation. And here's the lesson I draw for this, and kind of the bow I want to put on this entire study. As Christians, we need to be shrewd, not just innocent, but wise. And resourcefulness is not just knowing what you have in your hand, but assuming what the other person has in their deck. What play they're wanting to make, what bluffs they're making, what powers they have, what lies they tell. Look, as Christians, if we're going to be a church that confronts culture, we need to be smarter, shrewder, wiser, and more resourceful than anyone of this world. May God empower you to do just that as you build His church.